It's Friday, and that means it's time for the next in our Fanzine Friday series. Today we're taking a look at news from Bree from August of 1977. Please stick around. I'm AZ Mountaineer, and this is our channel, Old School Rules, where we celebrate the community of old school gamers and grognards who like classic RPGs, miniatures, magazines, and everything that goes with it. Each week on the Fanzine Friday series, I take a fanzine from my collection off the shelf for a closer look. And this week, that's News from Bree, number 22, produced by Hartley Patterson, published in August of 1977. Hope you enjoy today's video. So this week, I'm back to my series of News from Bree. We've been taking a look at those for the last several videos before we paused and looked at alarms and excursions last week. This is Hartley Patterson. It's from the UK. It's paper folded in half, stapled through the middle, has a heavy stock cover, and is a fanzine that's primarily focused on Dungeons and Dragons, although they cover other material and they certainly review all kinds of things, including war games, sci-fi, fantasy, fiction, and others. So let's take a look at this week's selection. This cover art is from Stephen Lyons. We've been seeing his cover art on News from Bree for several issues now. And here he's just got sort of a soldier, a fighter, it looks like, although he's got sort of wizard's pointed cap, right? Who has overcome his foes. Looks like the last blow of the battle has been struck. I don't know who's in the background here, if these are his fallen comrades he's remembering, spirits of his ancestors. But in any event, that's the end of whoever he was fighting against. The editorial and news of note here from Hartley Patterson, and it's several pages long this time. He's got a lot to say. He does mention he's a little late because he just didn't have enough in the way of submissions to fill the magazine, and so he's imploring people to please continue to send in more submissions. He said in particular he needs longer articles or scenarios, many adventures to put in here. If you recall, last time he had a poll, and he doesn't give results like some people would, where they sort of like give you the raw data. He just gives you his conclusions. So he got up 40 people to reply, so much better than the last time he asked for input. So the top things people were wanting to see: information about new games, Dungeons and Dragons articles, and Dungeons and Dragons mini adventures or scenarios that they could run. He also mentioned an interesting thing that you recall, he's done a lot of miniature reviews, and he said a lot of people said they didn't want information about miniatures, but then some small number really did, and he said he likes it, doesn't see anyone else doing it, so he's going to continue to do it. And you'll see he has the latest installment of that later in this issue. He talks a little bit about the convention scene, that there aren't really enough, and that he's really eager to go and see one or be part of one, and maybe he'll have to organize it himself, he says, because he hasn't seen that being done. He does comment on Games Workshop's event, but says that's mostly selling games and not playing games, which is what he wants. But you'll know, if you're familiar with the history over there in the UK, that Games Workshop does in fact start a convention for the playing of Dungeons and Dragons very, very soon. He mentions a little bit about the Dungeons and Dragons Society, of which I believe he's one of the leaders, and says essentially that was an organization set up just to help people get connected, players to DMs. So not much to that. Gives a little bit of history here about some fanzines. So and then he talks about some fanzines that have come in. He says a fanzine called Supernova by Lou Pulsipher, when he lived in the United States, was the original, or Lou's told him is the original fantasy and science fiction game design. And then that's been passed over to Ken St. Andre, who is the author of Tunnels and Trolls. Chaosium's Nomad Gods had just come out and is supposed to be very good based on what he's heard. Hasn't played it yet. And then he talks about a number of other games he says that people should avoid, that he didn't like very much. He talks about the fact that this Silmarillion has just come out at this point in time. Talks about some other board games from people like SPI, and also mentions that there's a movie he's heard good things about over in America called Star Wars that he hasn't had a chance to see just yet. So I thought that was a interesting little piece of history. Okay, let's talk about the table of contents. So we had the editorial and the news that I just covered. There's reviews of miniatures, and those are Brian Ansell's Asgard miniatures that are being discussed. And I think we'll talk about that in just a minute. Then he talks also about the designs, and you'll remember that he makes it very much a point of covering not only sort of Dungeons and Dragons RPG designs, but war game designs, what they call dippy designs for the game of diplomacy, as well as a bunch of information about fantasy and science fiction, fantasy writing fanzines that are out there in the world. So we're not going to focus on those, but we'll talk about the fanzines that are here. Alarms and Excursions, The Wild Hunt, Troll Crusher, Quincy Quick Gazette, White Dwarf has just come out, the Fantorgan Scrolls, I'm still hunting for some copies of that, and Massey Moore of Trevorrow, which is focused on a particular person's game, and then also Worm's Footnotes, which is Chaosium's published magazine, really, or maybe a fanzine. And then a number of wargame fanzines: Pursue and Destroy, Perfidious Albion, Signal, Wargamer, Diplomacy World, Ethel and Frog, Mad Policy, and Who's Where. Then he talks about some fiction, fantasy science fiction fanzines, but then mentions a number that he received but he doesn't have a chance to make any comments about. I'm going to go down through that list in the comments down below and look at those if you would. And we'll figure out whether maybe some of those are in fact Dungeons and Dragons RPG related fanzines rather than fiction writing fanzines, of which there are a lot at this point, still are. There's a review for a sci-fi game called Starsoliders. It gets a pretty good review, although they say there's not enough sort of depth to the game. It's sort of just battling soldiers, in outer space or on other planets. The World of Tears is an outdoor setting, and we'll talk about that in more detail. And then Farnazel's Guide to Dungeons actually moves outside today, he says. And I thought it was going to be about wilderness encounters, but in fact it's a lengthy discussion of economics and the weight of gold, how much gold you could have, and how different size coins, one, what they weigh, and two, how much you should really be spending based on how much those coins weigh, trying to sort of compare it to what the economy was like shortly before the arrival, around the time of the arrival of gunpowder. Again, I don't consider those sort of crunchy bits all that exciting for my game, but some people clearly do, and he wanted to really dive into realism as it relates to coins, both their weight and their value in an economy. He has an article about wargaming versus Dungeons and Dragons, and talks about the fact that the wargaming community has been trying to figure out how to make an exciting game that incorporated fantasy into it, but would still be wargaming as opposed to the role-playing that Dungeons and Dragons brought on. Stick around, Hartley, because there's a company called Games Workshop who's going to solve that with a game called Warhammer. Then there's a letters column. Say a little bit more about that in a bit because there's quite a few, and a review of a game called 1066, which is a period war game. Okay, so let's take a look at our contributors. Hartley Patterson is responsible for putting this fanzine together. Stephen Lines, Nick Slope, and Paul Blackwell contribute art, and we'll look at that in a moment. Dave Waring, Dave Griffin, and Andrew Fletcher each contribute a monster. And again, those just sort of randomly placed in the magazine, and we'll take a look at those in a second as well. Martin Easterbrook did the review for 1066, and Roger Sandell did the review for the Sci-Fi game. Here are our monsters. As we know, my mantra is you can never have too many. They tested a little in this case, but here we go. Groundhogs, which are not what we think of as groundhogs at all. In fact, these are rubbery creatures with a proboscis that shoots globs of sticky compound at you. It can be removed with alcohol, so for those characters who like to carry ale or wine with them, I guess they're in luck. But they say that this is kind of creative. The globs slow you down, and if they can make a hit, they can also cause suffocation. The giant sun plant is a carnivorous plant. I imagine it like the Venus flytrap, because it says it curls over and traps the victims, but in the interior is the sticky gooey substance that you'll get stuck in. Has the appearance of gemstones, which is, I think, quite clever. So you go in obviously to get that unsuspecting, and you get closed upon and digested. And then the lesser quacker, it's a little gonzo, right? It looks like a duck, but it quacks continuously, and it's a sort of harmless encounter, but it follows you around quacking and attracting wandering monsters. Very good for the extreme lawful party who doesn't want to kill an innocent sort of creature that's causing them, even though it's causing them a problem. So it could be a little fun to do. It says it always wants to follow people who have Burgess pies. You'll remember in an earlier issue, Hartley talked about this guy who would make these pies. I don't really know what that's about, but it continues to be a theme for them. And then the other thing about this little quacker is that it can create limited teleports at random when in danger. And also, if it focuses its quacking, apparently it can bring in certain weather conditions, anything from a light drizzle to a heavy thunderstorm. So again, lots of creative stuff going on in the early days. And some of it's certainly not the sort of typical hack and slash monster encounters we're used to. The fanzine, the fanzine reviews miniatures this month. It's Asgard miniatures, recently started by Brian Ansell. And if you remember him, he's very well known in the miniature community over in the United Kingdom. He works for Asgard Miniatures. He later goes and works for Games Workshop a couple of times, ultimately responsible, I think, for, the evolution of Warhammer, the presence of Citadel miniatures. He's apparently, from what I read and hear, was considered extremely talented and very good, not only at the design of the miniature figures, but also sort of the business of getting those well made and out into the market. So let's take a look at the art. This is Stephen Lyon's art. He's got several pieces that are sort of science fantasy type art. He's got this trooper. He's got the Conan guy battling a giant eye, another trooper floating through space, and then this Pulp Fiction looking futuristic world with a guy riding a dragon over these craggy mountains, and then this gargoyle looking head here at the side. I'm not sure what that thing is. It was just random. So then we have art by Nick Slope, and he's got three pieces. He's got the rear cover, which is sort of a, not a mugshot, but like a family portrait of this adventuring party, right? You get the wizard, fighter, I'm going to guess cleric in the back, a dwarf, and I don't know what this other creature is. I guess it's a halfling because it has hairy feet and a pipe. And then he's just got some random drawings of some knights as well. And our final artist is Paul Blackwell, and he just has some random drawings. Reminds me a little bit of Tom Wam from TSR, but he's got these guys, these dwarves trying to go into this building, or through these doors, and then just some random drawings as well. The adventure this time is called The World of Tears, and as Hartley explains his concept, it's like the tears of a wedding cake. It's a broader vision of these futuristic, immortal, super powerful beings that have created these pocket dimensions, and the one that survives gives you, these alternate locations. And this one has built a world about 30,000 foot cliffs. So they're circular worlds or land masses. 30,000 foot cliffs separate them. If you guys want to try and climb that, you can move from one tier to another. This particular one he picks, he says, is a pre-Columbian America type setting. You come through a gate to enter at the southern side of the map, and there's a couple different Indian tribes or Native American tribes here, like Mayans, and I think from my read, sounds like maybe like Plains Indians from North America. Here, some other random monsters you could encounter. You're trying to get to the northern side of the map, where there's a giant tower or obelisk, and you have to get to the top, and there's a whole challenge and trick to that. And when you do, there's a gate up there, but that's not the end. You go through that gate, and then you come into a little dungeon, which I can probably map out from his description, but he doesn't have any map for it, and he just goes through a number of trips and tricks and traps you have to get through to try and find your way out. And then eventually, he says, when you get to the end, he would just make that last door open up into whatever your normal dungeon would be. So it's probably, depending on how much time your party spends exploring around this world, a couple of sessions. He says he's play tested it twice. It took about 8 hours each time. I don't know how, but miraculously, he said nobody, when he played through it, died. He does say it's not first level, it's more like third to sixth level. And so maybe that's one of the things that helped. And here's his discussion of the wilderness, which, as I said, is really just a discussion of economics and coins. And then we have the letters section, which we have quite a few, and I thought I would just talk a little bit about those because I think it's kind of interesting because it gives you a flavor of what's going on in Dungeons and Dragons and what people are talking about. In a prior issue, we talked about Lou Pulsipher's idea. When the very first time he had someone play the game, what he would do is give you characters from the Lord of the Rings books, and you'd go through the Mines of Moria adventure. So he said people were sort of oriented, knew a little bit about what was going on. So here people are engaged in the debate about what Gandalf is and how to sort of translate him into Dungeons and Dragons. They're sort of disagreeing with Lou's idea. They're also talking about the other characters and what level Boromir and Aragorn should be and stuff like that. Lou Pulsipher writes in this time to talk about the review of Lankmere, the box set that was put out by TSR, and frankly says he didn't think it was all that good and doesn't know why the guy who did the review thought it was very good. He said the game sort of was boring and became super defensive, and they needed to have some alternate rule to force people to engage in combat, or you're just going to sit there forever. That's kind of his theory. The next one is talking about just the role of deities and the chance to have divine intervention, and also arguing that you should incorporate all kinds of, so Dungeons and Dragons is complete fantasy anyway. You might as well incorporate whatever you feel like and don't restrict yourself to sort of, the sort of medieval fantasy setting. Bring in sci-fi and other time periods freely is his idea. We've got someone in here who's talking about how he defends himself against charm person spells. He doesn't really say what it is. He just said he's figured out how to successfully convince his DM he can work his way out of a charm person. I don't know. That's really the spirit of the rules. And then there's this discussion of some prior correspondence about whether characters should know their hit points. I guess Hartley had this idea that each time you go in, he rolls your hit points for the adventure. And so you don't know, last time you had 10, this time you might have 4, assuming you didn't go up a level, right? And so it's always a surprise to you, even though you say you took 3 points of damage, you don't know if your next blow is going to be fatal. And he said that's kind of his idea because you shouldn't know that. I mean, I get the point, but I don't know. I don't think it's the spirit of what I'm used to, I guess, more than anything. Don Turnbull, who shows up several times in the future of Dungeons and Dragons, writes in again with a comment on Farnazel's Guide to Dungeons last time, where he had tips for dungeon masters, and he talked about whether you should ever fudge rolls or change your adventure. I think it's more a disagreement about the words than the ideas, because there's an editorial at the end from Hartley where he says he doesn't really disagree with him, in particular about changing maybe what was in your dungeon once you see where your players are, right? So you had a really hard encounter, but maybe only half the party's still alive. Do you really still leave that in there or not? And then finally some discussion about how to do experience points and how much of a role treasure should play in experience, which of course it is a very important part at the early stages of the game. As to say here, it's primarily how you gained experience, not so much the monsters, but the loot. And he doesn't like that, so he wants to give people more XP for doing what their class does. Fighters for fighting, magic users for spells, thieves for thieving, I suppose. And I think that's a decent idea. I always try to reward players when they play to their class's strength as well. Okay, so that's it for this episode of Fanzine Friday. That's a look at News from Bree, number 22, from August of 1977. I have one more of these, which I'll do next week, News of Bree 23, and then we'll be moving on to a different fanzine. So if there's something that you're interested in, if I have it in my collection, I'd be glad to go there next. I haven't really decided where to go after News from Bree, but fortunately I've got lots of stuff up on the shelf to choose from. Hope you're enjoying the series. If you haven't already, please think about subscribing so you get notice of all our new content. Try to put stuff out a couple times a week. And until next time, my friends, keep rolling 20s.